The domino theory is the belief that if one country falls to communism, neighboring countries will also fall to communism. And this domino theory led to the U.S. involvement in a number of countries in Asia. Specifically, because of the domino theory, the U.S. wanted to prevent the spread of communism in Korea and Vietnam. If you look at this map of Asia, you can see where Korea is. Now today, Korea is divided into two parts, North Korea and South Korea. And if we're remembering the basic idea of the domino theory, which is that if one country falls to communism, then the other countries around it will fall. Well, after World War II, China was communist, and North Korea was becoming communist. South Korea was where the U.S. stepped in to prevent the further spread of communism. Some important background information on the Korean War was that Korea had been ruled by Japan since 1910. But when Japan lost World War II, Korea was split into two parts. The USSR took over the northern half of Korea, and the US took over the southern half. And the dividing line between these two sections was at the 38th parallel on the map. So that's the line of latitude, the 38th parallel. And with half the country controlled by communist Soviets and half the country controlled by the US, Korea really developed into two different countries with two different governments. So the North Korean capital was at Pyongyang, and North Korea, which was ruled by the Soviets, had close ties with the USSR and with China. And the Soviets withdrew their troops that were stationed there from World War II in late 1948. South Korea, the capital was Seoul, and they had close links with the U.S. Now, the Americans withdrew their troops who had been stationed there after World War II, starting in 1949. So you see both the U.S. and the USSR removing their initial troops, the men left over from World War II, right before 1950. The Korean War starts in June of 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, hoping to unify the country under one communist government. Now, when North Korea invaded, the United Nations voted to condemn this invasion, and the United Nations organized an army to oppose it. So 16 countries worked together to send soldiers to Korea to protect South Korea, although more than 90% of those soldiers came from just the United States. During the first few months of the Korean War, the Northern Communist Army swept south and conquered almost all of South Korea. The UN troops counterattacked against the Communists in September of 1950 and were able to successfully push the Northern Army back into North Korea. At this point, Communist China came to the aid of North Korea and sent many troops to force back UN troops. By mid-1951, the war had reached a stalemate, meaning neither side could make any further advances, and each army dug in defensively near the original border between North and South Korea, which was the 38th parallel. After the war reaches a stalemate, peace talks between North and South Korea started in July of 1951 and lasted 2 years until July of 1953, when a truce was signed between the two sides. Nearly 5 million people died during the Korean War, and the border at that 38th parallel remained the same as before the war. The North was ruled by a communist dictator, and they also had slower economic growth than South Korea. So after the U.S. gets involved in Korea because of the domino theory, they also get involved in Vietnam because of the domino theory. Important background info to know about Vietnam is that France had controlled Vietnam before it was taken over by Japan in World War II. So after World War II, France tried to reestablish control of Vietnam, but a lot of people living in Vietnam were nationalists. They wanted independence. And the Vietnamese communists argued with the French over control of Vietnam starting in 1945, once World War II ends. And the Vietnamese communists, who are known as Viet Minh, were supported by Soviets and the Chinese against the French. Now, as the French are trying to regain control of Vietnam after World War II, ultimately they're going to lose. And the people who they're going to lose to are the Viet Minh. And these are Vietnamese nationalists and communists. And they were led by a man named Ho Chi Minh, whose picture you can see here. And Ho Chi Minh led the Viet Minh to war with the French in 1946. The U.S. provided military and financial aid to the French because they were afraid that if Vietnam fell to communism, then other countries in the area would fall to communism. And despite U.S. aid, the French lost control of Vietnam in 1954. And as a result, Vietnam split into a north that was communist and a south that was pro-Western, a pro-democracy. And if we look at this map of Vietnam in relation to other countries in Eastern Asia, you can see why the U.S. thought it was important according to the Domino theory. You have China up north, and they are a strong communist country. Then you had North Vietnam that was also communist at this time. Now, according to the beliefs of the Domino theory, if South Vietnam fell to communism, then you had 3 other countries in the immediate area who were also at risk of falling to communism. And those countries were Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. A bit after the French lose control of Vietnam, the U.S. begins to get directly involved. In August of 1964, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson, known as LBJ, claims that North Vietnam attacked American ships off the coast of Vietnam. In response to this, the United States Congress passes something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water near Vietnam, and what this resolution did was it was basically a decision that gave LBJ broad war power, so he could take military action against the North Vietnamese. And once LBJ had this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, in March of 1965, he began sending the first ground troops, the first American soldiers, to Vietnam. And Americans, even though they went into Vietnam confident, they quickly realized what a strong fight these Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, were putting up. By 1968, American forces and South Vietnamese forces drastically outnumbered the North Vietnamese communist fighters. But even though the U.S. had greater numbers and more advanced technology than the North Vietnamese communists, the U.S. could not defeat them. The U.S. was contending with a group of people known as the Viet Cong, and these were pro-communism guerrilla fighters in South Vietnam, people who wanted the North to succeed and were living in the South. Because the U.S. was struggling in Vietnam, a lot of Americans back at home in the U.S. started to turn against the war, and they started protesting against military action in Vietnam. And these strong anti-war attitudes in America caused President Lyndon B. Johnson to not seek re-election in 1968. So Johnson is out. The new president who comes in is named Richard Nixon, and when Nixon is president, the U.S. begins withdrawing troops from Vietnam. And eventually, the U.S. signs a ceasefire agreement with the North Vietnamese in 1973. After U.S. troops left Vietnam, the North Vietnamese communists took over the country in 1975.